Hi everyone, in this video we're going to be moving on to part 2 of our series on dynamic array functions in Excel. So continuing on with our series on dynamic arrays in Excel and functions that can take advantage of dynamic arrays, if you didn't see the previous video, you may want to look at it and introduce yourself to unique function, sort function, and filter function options that allow you to create dynamic arrays. But now what we're going to do is really explore some of the long existing functions in Excel that can now take advantage of the concept of dynamic arrays. We're going to start with a couple of the text functions. So the first one we're going to look at is the left function. So if I wanted to, for example, grab the leftmost, say, 5 letters of the customer name, and I don't want to do this in the table itself, I want it to be in another area of the sheet, or maybe even on a different tab. As we know, I can take the left function, simply point to the text, in this case point to the name, and let's say 5, 5, and nothing revolutionary about this. And of course, if I want to do that for all the items on this table, I could simply copy this down, and there you go. But now what happens is if I go and add another record, let's just say add another record to this table, and in order to get the left function to extend to the newly added row, I'm going to have to manually key in the formula or again copy it down manually. If I had another 10 rows, every time I change, I'd have to do something. And similarly, if one of these rows were to be removed, one of these rows would actually lose the reference as well, particularly if it was on a different sheet. Now, there's a much better way of doing this, so let's take a look at that. So we'll start off exactly the same as before. We'll start using the left function, but now instead of simply pointing to this field with this cell, which is effectively B2, part of the table, we will point to the entire array. In this case, it is the entire column B of this table, and then we'll put in again comma and 5. And now what we'll do is we'll get a spill dynamic array result set that includes all of the records or all of the items in the spreadsheet in the table, and it is dynamic. It will update dynamically. So for example, if I were to manually change east of Chicago to west of Chicago, and you notice that immediately our array is updated. But now more interestingly, because that would happen with the other formula as well, if I add a new record at the bottom here, so let's call it Marcana Stadium, and let me just type that in, and you'll notice that it immediately added that new record. Similarly, if this was linked to a dynamic data source that was linked to, let's say, a SQL Server table, maybe from your ERP system, and you would right click and refresh this, if it resulted in more rows or fewer rows, it doesn't matter. Your array would basically faithfully represent the right sequence, the first 5 characters of the customer name for the object of the entire table. Now, the same concept applies to pretty much all of the other topical text and string functions that you may be accustomed to that allow you to manipulate the contents of a cell or a column in terms of text. So I'm just going to show you. For example, you notice that some of the customer names or company names are all in caps, and most of them are not. Most of them are a mix of the capital letters and lowercase letters, which is called proper case, but there are a few of them that are, uppercase. And if we want to get to the point where we want to change these and maybe put them in a separate table or copy the table where none of them are in all caps, or maybe all of them are in all caps, we could do something like this. We could say equals proper, which is another text function, and once again just select the entire column instead of one individual cell and have all this. Similarly, we could change that, and let's just say we'll make them all uppercase, do the same thing, and now they're all uppercase. And of course, we could copy this and paste values into somewhere else to permanently save these as improper case. And yes, before you start wondering, in case you start wondering, you can mix and match again these formula with some of the other dynamic array formulas. So for example, we could potentially sort these alphabetically if we wanted to. We could simply edit the formula and wrap the sort function around it, and there was only one column, so the sort index is going to be column 1, and now we have uppercase customer name sorted alphabetically. Next, let's take a look at an interesting function called VStack. The stack allows us to literally stack different ranges from different sources on the spreadsheet, or even from different workbooks, even into what looks like a single table or a single array of data. Now, I'm going to use this opportunity to illustrate the power of using tables, one of the oldest functions in Excel. It's been around forever, and these two pieces of data are not actually tables. They're simply data in a tabular format, but I've not converted these ranges into tables, so it's just basically a range. I'm going to first use VStack with these, and I'm going to show you some of the limitations and explain why it would be better to actually use tables for these dynamic arrays. So let's use the VStack function. I'm going to assume that this table was for our Canadian sales and it came out of our ERP system. And this table is for our US sales and it came out of a completely different system, which is why they're in two different spreadsheets or two different areas of the spreadsheet. For convenience of a tutorial, they're on one tab, but normally they'll be on different tabs or even different workbooks. I want to combine them so I just get a sense of what's going on overall. We'll do some further analysis. I do VStack equals VStack, and I simply point to the first range or array, and in this case I'm simply going to highlight that range and then point to the second one, and now what it's going to do, it's going to give me a spilled array that stacks these on top of each other. If, for example, I were to change, let's say, the amount of that first one from $900 to $59, you'll see that the array immediately updates itself. And even though it's an array, you can't format this column to get a much better looking result set. And again, if I change it back to 900, it will update accordingly. So this is actually very useful, but there's two shortcomings here. And the first shortcoming is very simple for us to deal with, and that's the fact that there's no headers. Well, you can always simply add on another range, and in this case, in the beginning of the VStack formula, to specify the column headings from one of our two sets of table. So I'm going to do that. I'm simply going to go to the beginning of this formula, and I'm going to pick that range, put a comma, and now we actually have column headings as well, so that's great. What's not so great is if, for example, if I were to add another record, I'll just to keep things simple and quick, I'll copy that and I'll just add it in as another record here, because I specifically selected a range that only includes these rows. It doesn't recognize that I've added anything, and it will not update my dynamic array, and my arrays are not really all that dynamic, so we can do better. How we can do better is what we can do, and this is one of the advantages of using a table. There are some disadvantages, but generally speaking, when you have this form of data in Excel, you're adding a table. Turning it into a table allows for a lot more flexibility. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to insert table, group done, Control Shift T. My table does have headers, and now we've turned it into a table, and I'm going to do the same thing here. Now I can't just expect this formula to automatically figure out what I've done. So what we'll do is we'll simply delete this formula altogether, and now we'll enter a new version of the formula where we will say VStack, start off with the header rows, so just the headers, and then use the actual table content of the first table, and then stack the table contents of the table on the second table. And now this is always completely and appropriately dynamically rearrange itself. So if I were to add a record, again, I'll just copy this to be safer. If I add a record here, it immediately updates my dynamic array. So hopefully that gives you a little bit more insight into why you may want to use tables when you're working with dynamic arrays and dynamic formula, unless there's another compelling reason not to turn your data into a table. So finally, for this tutorial, we're going to look at a function called Choosecols. And yes, you probably guessed it, it allows us to create a dynamic array that uses specific columns of the source table or the source data array. So in this example, we'd like to create a dynamic array that doesn't include all of the columns of the table, but just selected ones. This is often useful when you have a table of data that has dozens or even sometimes hundreds of columns, and you like to create a dynamically updated abstract of just the key columns that you're particularly interested in trying to analyze. So although we only have 6 columns here, let's just imagine that we had 20 or 30 columns, and from that 20 or 30 column array, we want to create a separate array that will dynamically update whenever this data was updated or refreshed from the database. That would simply show us the customer name, the country, and let's say the sales value. So Choosecols is a great way of doing that. You create the equals Choosecols formula, and you can put it anywhere. It doesn't really matter where on the sheet, and I'll select the array. Now in this case I could simply select the table data. I would not get the headings, or I can select the entire table and just make sure that it is in the table and not in a range. So it says, table or, and then I simply select the columns numerically. So invoice is the first column, customer name is column 2, so let's just say we want column 2. We want column 5 and we want column 6. That's all we want. We now have a dynamic array. We can resize so we can actually see this better. And again, we can format the money column, and you can store it somewhere. We can fiddle around with the format of the header if we wanted to, but it's still going to dynamically update when we change things. So again, if I were to change, let's use Mark's company, and change that from 1200 to 6547, you'll notice that the dynamic array updates as well. And of course, if we were to delete any of the records, then its dynamic array would update as well. In fact, let's just do that. Let's go ahead and entirely delete row number 4, and you'll notice that the array updated and removed that record as well. I will point out that similarly, there is also a choose rows column that does the same basic idea, except allows you to select rows from a range as opposed to columns, but works in an identical fashion. So we hope you found at least some of the functionality addressed in this video to be useful. Stay tuned for part 3 of the series that's going to delve a little bit deeper into more of the advanced Excel features that here at Blue Link we found extremely useful in dissecting and analyzing our business data. So as always, thanks for watching, and be sure to like and subscribe for more advanced Excel function tutorial videos coming up.